Everyone. Welcome everyone to the fourth webinar hosted by Critical China Scholars. Tonight we're talking about anti-China politics in the US election. I'm Jake Werner. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Global Development Policy Center, which is at Boston University. And I'm also a member of the organizing committee at CCS. If you want to find out more about what we're working on at CCS, please visit our website. It's criticalchinascholars.org. If you want to join our listserv, you can sign up via the website. And before we get started on the webinar tonight, I'd like to let everyone know that we have another webinar coming up next month. It will be about China's capitalism and the world. It'll be on November 19th, which is a Thursday, from 7 to 8:30 p.m. Eastern time. So that webinar is going to take a look at the increasing involvement of China in the world, not so much by focusing on the Belt and Road Initiative, which has gotten a huge amount of attention, but rather trying to dig underneath some of the more superficial coverage that has really taken pride of place in the discussion of China in the world. And we're going to be welcoming a number of researchers who have done very in-depth, on-the-ground research on the way that Chinese investment and economic initiatives are playing out in South America and Southeast Asia and in sub-Saharan Africa to try to better understand how China's initiatives are reshaping local life, resource extraction, and relations of political domination and resistance, as well as reshaping the global system. So please join us for that. Again, that's November 19th at 7 p.m. Eastern. So before I welcome our panelists to talk today, I want to say a few words about Critical China Scholars. What are we? What are we critical of exactly? Well, essentially what we're going for here is a ruthless criticism of everything existing. But more specifically, of course, we need to have a focus beyond that. Of course, it's China, and our webinars have primarily focused on critical perspectives on inequality and oppression within China. But we also believe that most of the criticism of China that takes place in the West does so in service to establishing a strong self-other binary. So, for example, China is authoritarianism to the democracy of the West. China is a human rights outlaw, and the West stands for defends human rights. China is bullying other countries while the West defends an inclusive, rules-based order. We believe instead, in contrast to that approach, that more often than not, the forms of oppression and inequality that prevail in China can be found in the West as well. They may be rationalized in somewhat different ways, but they're generally driven by the same structural logics of power and accumulation. And we believe that where there are real contrasts, these are best understood less as opposite poles and more as two sides of the same coin. And the reason for that is that we believe the US and China are not different by virtue of racial or cultural essence, but because they occupy different positions in a single global system. And following from that, we believe that progressive change in any given country is inextricably bound up with progressive change around the world. And so one of the concerns here is to make sure that we have a critical perspective on China that helps us be clear about critical perspectives on the West and to understand in a deeper way how those are connected. But nonetheless, there are some very serious dangers to progressive priorities in China, in the United States, and in countries around the world that are posed today by the tensions mapped by the idea of national difference and by the rising nationalisms we see around the world that emerge from that. And so that's what we want to explore tonight, specifically with reference to how China fits into US politics. So joining us tonight are panelists from academia, from journalism, from the think tank world, from organizing. So we have quite a diverse set of perspectives, but I think the thing that joins them is that they have all thought deeply and carefully about the US-China relationship and about how the growing excuse me, how the growing tensions between the two countries are playing out in the United States, in China, and for other countries that are being drawn into those tensions. So we're going to examine tonight how those tensions have been heightened, have been changed by xenophobia and by anti-China politics in election politics this season. So before I introduce our first panelist, I just want to thank our co-sponsors for this event. Co-sponsors are Justices Global, the journal Made in China, another journal, Positions Politics, as well as the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung New York office. And I would like to ask everyone in the audience, please turn off your video if you have it on currently. Hopefully that will reduce the burden on servers everywhere and give us a smoother picture. And finally, we welcome questions. We will be devoting about half of the time tonight to Q&A with the panel. Please submit any questions you have in the chat, and then we'll be getting to those after short presentations by each of the panelists. So once again, thank you everyone who has come. A preliminary thank you to the panelists, and we'll get started with Christian Sorace. Christian is an assistant professor of political science at Colorado College. His work explores the intersection of comparative politics, political theory, and aesthetics. And he's going to be talking tonight about the role that China is playing on discourse in the two major parties during the election. So take it away, Christian.
All right, thank you so much, Jake, for inviting me. And I am extemporaneously changing up slightly what I'm going to talk about. My remarks might be a little speculative, so I hope that they work and cohere. But basically, this semester I've been teaching a course on psychoanalysis and politics and film, and I've been thinking a lot about knowledge production. And so I've also been thinking self-critically about what we as scholars of China are actually engaging in these conversations. And one thing that keeps coming up in my course is that it does not matter how much we know unless something changes at the level of our desire. As psychoanalyst Renetta Selekel has put it, the way we relate to knowledge is never neutral. So what matters is not the production of knowledge per se, but the ways in which the knowledge is contextualized, framed, and inscribed within our own economies of desires and fantasies. Another way to put it is that we're not actually adding new information that we didn't know already. For instance, if you are a supporter of Donald Trump, as I imagine, most of the viewers in this audience are, I'm kidding, obviously, not one more scandal or fact check will probably change your mind or call into question that attachment. The comedian John Oliver actually did a quite funny bit on spoofing this, the repetition of the aha, gotcha moment, and then the deflation when nothing actually changes. So again, the kind of additive idea of if only people were to know this doesn't actually change the economy of people's desires and attachments. Similarly, if we talk about people who are, and unfortunately we do need to address this, who are denying what is happening in Xinjiang, we really need to recognize that not one more satellite image, one more heartbreaking survivor testimony, or even one more leaked document of the Chinese government's own admission will change their minds about what is happening or not happening there, because it does not actually fit within the phantasmatic space or the economy of their own desire. I actually want to refrain from saying fit within their narrative, because narrative still keeps things at too cerebral, abstract, and discursive a level, when what I'm really talking about is a whole range of affects and attachments. We can think of the example that Jacques Lacan gave of the lover who thinks their partner is cheating and spends all of their time trying to find confirmation of this. And Lacan's reading of this was that paranoia actually is not a response to some empirical trigger, but is the structure of the subject, right? So even if the subject finds that the partner is cheating, it actually already was the structure of the subject's desire. And why do I bring this up? Because I've been reflecting recently on the feeling I get when we're engaging in debates on Twitter with people that are fundamentally not debatable, which then raises a question of what are we doing? As scholars with a shared set of critical commitments and attachments of our own, I hope it's not as naive as it might sound, but how should we actually be spending our time in engagement? And do we spend our time arguing with those who, as Sartre put it long ago in his comments on anti-Semitism, desire to be a stone? This part of this conversation for me is not at all about engaging in a conversation about what's actually happening in China. That's totally separate, and that should be had. We can discuss that on its own terms. But what the role that China plays in political discourse, China as a screen for the projections and anxieties of US politics, China as a scapegoat for the contradictions between global political economy and the nation state form. And as Jake nicely put it in his introduction, right, all of the problems internal to global capitalism then get mediated and kind of explained away through the figure of China. So what I want to try to get us to do is to ask, if we map out what are the various discursive positions on China, the hawkish Republican position, the kind of position more associated with engagement. If we recall that letter, the pre-COVID letter from a year ago, China is not the enemy, right? What are the underlying attachments to certain visions of the world and the role that China plays in it? Can we map out that structure and then start to think about what can we do to open up a new space, new way of talking, and kind of drive a wedge for a counter-hegemonic discourse? So firstly, just to look very briefly at why, especially coming out of the Trump administration and the more hawkish line, why China attracts so much affective investment. Well, we can say, one, the legacies and tropes of xenophobia are being recycled. Two, the legacies and tropes of anti-communism. Three, China's position in the global economy, combined with the crumbling of US hegemony, create this kind of perfect storm. And so, I mean, like, just if we do an experiment and go and look at some of our fearless cold warriors on Twitter today, and think about it, they see Chinese influence everywhere. Again, which is not to deny, to go back to the Lacan example, that China is not engaging in certain modes of attempting to frame things that benefit themselves, the Communist Party, but that what is that excitement or paranoid attachment to the figure of China? As Zizek would probably put it, they're enjoying their symptom, which is why all of the other horrific shit happening in the world right now, like what India is doing in Kashmir and other places, doesn't elicit the same kind of response, because it doesn't trigger their desire in the same way. It doesn't fit into this deep need and attachment to a narrative that there's some battle between freedom and democracy against communism. Right. So then if we go a little bit further, it's very clear why Trump is blaming China, because China then becomes the obstacle. everything was going great beforehand. Trump was winning. We were all winning, right? Then the COVID pandemic starts, and that is what Trump is desperately trying to, in his campaign, attach to, right? If it were not for China and for COVID, and that's why he, has all of these egregious and racist ways of describing the virus. If it were not for that, America would be doing great. So again, there's a displacement away from the problems of capitalism and for the sheer train wreck that's been Trump's presidency that gets displaced onto China. As I've argued before in another context, that if we look at, I looked closely at what the All Republican China Task Force. I've read closely Mike Pompeo's speeches and other speeches, and one of the rhetoric that keeps coming up again and again is that there's this binary opposition, that China is a threat to the U.S. way of life, to freedom, to all of these things. And again, that is a way of displacement. The fact that right now we're witnessing the sheer undemocratic nature of U.S. democracy, we're witnessing the legacies and ongoing present of racism in the U.S. And all of these things are kind of coming to a head right now. China becomes the perfect way to distract us from rethinking democracy in the U.S. Jake, if you won't mind, just also letting me know how much time I have, because I again, like I said, I'm being very speculative and a little bit off the cuff here, so I don't want to take up too much time. But one thing I want to look at is, so there was a recent article in Newsweek by Didi Kirsten Tatlow that talks about over 600 organizations engaged in all of these nefarious activities in the U.S. That are, can be linked back to the Chinese Communist Party. Okay, I just want to look at the level of ideological inconsistency and desire operating in this article, because it's just so extraordinary in how terrible it is. So the article starts off by saying that there were a few tweets that were absolutely like the tweets of millions of other Americans dissatisfied with their political system. And then, however, the English was slightly off. A stray Chinese character slips in, and that this then is evidence of China attempting to sow the seeds of division. So here we have this, like, okay, the acknowledgement that people are extraordinarily dissatisfied with the lack of democracy, with states, racist violence, with all of these other things in the U.S. But nevertheless, China is attempting to sow those divisions, even though it just acknowledged that they were already there. Then later in the piece, the author writes, nor did the Chinese campaign typically spread disinformation. Okay, this is not Russia. Instead, they commonly shared, so these nefarious tweets commonly shared authentic content from legitimate news sources like the New York Times and MSNBC that highlighted racial divisions and inequality in the US. Okay, so are we literally saying that China's nefarious influence, and this is, the first few paragraphs of this Newsweek, article, that China is being blamed for precisely pointing out what is actually true? Then the report quotes the Australian ASPI saying the purpose of this kind of campaign is to denigrate the image of the US, end quote. And can I just say, with Trump as president, we do not need China to denigrate the image of the US. I was thinking of that funny line, like, how, who needs enemies with friends like these? Like, who needs China criticizing the US when our government is pretty explicit in terms of making a fool out of the US political system right now? Okay, anyway, so what I want to think about here is the fact that Of course, China is invested in making the US look bad. In my own research after the Sichuan earthquake, for a few years after the earthquake, every anniversary, the Renmin Robao would publish a piece being like, look at how well we've done, look at how in Katrina, 10 years after, there are still homeless people, right? It's part of their legitimation strategy to show the dysfunctions of democracy in order to show how stable authoritarianism is. And I think the proper response to that is to agree and say, not that says anything good about China's system, but to say, yeah, precisely the problem is that we do not live in a democracy that cares for all of its citizens and that has good social infrastructures. And it's our job to actually see what a democracy can do, because we haven't lived in one yet. Okay, so how am I doing? Can you tell me how I'm doing on time? So I have like some.
You should wrap up now.
All right. Oh, good. So let me see. Can I say? Okay. Yeah. Oh wow. Now I'm going to waste time trying to figure out how I can. All right. Okay. I'll just say something completely out of context. And then we can come back in the Q&A. But another thing that just puzzles me in terms of the discourse and trying to refuse the terms that are being offered us and try to think of new ways of talking about it that aren't just, engagement or hawkish, are questions like, we saw in the debates with the most recent debate between Trump and Biden. Trump, China will own the US if Biden is elected. Or the first debate, Trump, China perfected the art of the steal. So I want us to just critically think about what is with these anxieties of owning and being owned, and what are they actually telling us, and are they deeper symptoms of an anxiety of the crisis of sovereignty of the nation state and global capitalism? So here again, when we're talking about some ridiculous thing of China owning, what does it mean to be owned by China? It's clearly, I'd say, another symptom that is a way of avoiding the deeper crises within global capitalism. Okay, that's it.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you for bringing in psychoanalysis. I will say that as the crisis of American self-understanding has proceeded, I am finding it harder and harder to understand anything that's going on without the aid of psychoanalysis. So I appreciate you applying that to the China issue as well. All right, next up, we have Shen Lu. Shen Lu is a freelance journalist based in Boston. Her work explores the nexus of immigration, technology, and culture. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Politico Magazine, The Nation, Columbia Journalism Review, and other outlets. She's going to be talking tonight about how the election is affecting the Chinese diaspora in the US, as well as how the election is being received in China. Shen Lu.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction, Jake. I am going to start with how Chinese people are perceiving the US election in China. First, I would say that the people who care about the US election are the educated crowds in big cities. Most people, I would say they don't even pay attention to the US election. For those who do pay attention, they're processing the US election along with the pandemic that's ongoing and some of the civil unrest that's been happening here since summer. Many people were, for example, very gleeful when Donald Trump was diagnosed with COVID-19. A coronavirus, something that he had blamed China for since March. And when White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows said that the US was not going to control the pandemic, the clip also went viral in China on Weibo. Many people see this as an admission of defeat on the US side. I would say the general sentiment in China is amusement that many is perceiving a US that's on the decline. In terms of the the election itself, it's very hard for Chinese people to find reliable information about the election in China because Chinese state media, CCTV, Xinhua, and People's Daily, they largely stay quiet about the upcoming presidential election here. They are, the state media are reporting on the election, but they're limiting their coverage to major news developments like, the early voting turnouts. They're trying very hard to avoid predicting who might be winning where, because I think this has been consistent with past elections. News media are not allowed to take a stance in terms of when they're covering the election, because they don't want to be accused of meddling in the U.S. election. And local media, as far as I know, are not allowed to even cover the election at all. So Chinese people don't really have a reliable news source to learn about the election. I guess this is also intentional so that people there won't know how democracy works. I also talked to a former Chinese prominent newspaper editor, and he said that this year there has been additional directive from the Central Propaganda Department to warn news outlets to steer clear of election coverage, because they don't want to be accused of either endorse or oppose any particular candidate. And one exception is the Global Times. The Global Times has been highlighting chaos in the U.S. election for quite a long time. It has recently shared on social media clips of presidential debates where Trump contradicted himself or made illogical statements. And then there has also been a recent commentary published in the Global Times saying that the Senate confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett could be a major win for Trump. I think the tone in general in the Global Times is that the U.S. election is a messy process, and it's very efficient, and democracy is costly. And Global Times is like the only news outlet that's allowed to play a role that's allowed to be vocal about the election, and it plays a role in discrediting and criticizing the U.S. election and the democracy. That's the China side. And the Chinese diaspora, Chinese diaspora is not a monolith. Different people have different opinions about the election. And then there are also Chinese who are naturalized citizens who are not, and those who are only here to study and work. What's consistent with 2016 is that there has been the election has caused rifts among the first and second generation Chinese Americans. Many first generation immigrants were Trump voters in 2016. Those people tend to value stability, law and order over everything else, and a lot of them are against affirmative action and fear that everything that's happening in this country would hurt their own personal interest. This year, there have been popular conspiracy theories that are out there on WeChat and on Twitter as well, targeting that community, sort of stoking fear among them. Some of them are like QAnon style theories, such as, Biden's being pedophiles, sexually harassing young girls in China. Another popular one is that Kamala Harris was a mistress of somebody else, so that she's not a virtuous woman. And then there are all kinds of other, education policy related rumors that are specifically targeting this group. And the second generation Chinese Americans this year, they really started having conversations there with their parents. Ever since the Black Lives Matter movement, there have been quite a few articles, first person stories written by second generation Chinese immigrants writing to their parents and telling them why Asians should support Black people, why Asians should vote for Trump, vote for Biden this year. I've also noticed an interesting trend, which is there's been a rise of liberal-leaning WeChat accounts. After 2016, they're sort of claiming the space on WeChat, which has been a hotbed for disinformation and conspiracy theories spread by pro-Trump voices since 2016. So the liberal-leaning WeChat accounts, what they publish is what Chinese Americans care about the most. Their coverage is a bit different from the mainstream English language news media do. They talk about education, security, safety issues, rifts between the first and second generation Americans. Their target audience is the middle-aged Chinese Americans who heavily rely on WeChat for information, and they started after around 2016 or after 2016 because the pro-Trump WeChat accounts were really being extremely vocal in 2016, and then they wanted to counterbalance those conspiracy theories and just disinformation out there, which is quite plausible. And some of the accounts were run by professional journalists who were former investigative journalists in China, and they moved to the US or Canada after they found that they could no longer work as journalists. And so they started their own outlets in the US. And some of them were just run by political news junkies or community leaders who have a sense of responsibility in educating Chinese Americans. So what they do this year is they do not debunk specific rumors out there one by one. Instead they invite invite second generation Chinese Americans to write to their parents and tell them why they should support Biden instead of Trump. And then they also do in-depth profiles of prominent Chinese Americans to tell their stories of sort of transforming from Trump voters to Biden supportors. One article that I remember specifically was from a few weeks ago. This account is called Chinese Americans. They published a profile of a prominent Chinese American Trump voter who was also a former 2016 Trump campaign advisor. He talked about how this year's the federal government's failure in handling the pandemic and all sorts of anti-China rhetoric that's out there have turned a lot of former Trump supporters away. People are now fear about their own safety and not even speaking up. I think that's one of the reasons why I found that Chinese American Trump supporters this year are less vocal than 2016. A lot of people are scared about what they scared, if anything they say could cause them trouble in the future. that's the sentiment that we have learned among the Chinese American communities. And then apart from these liberal-leaning WeChat accounts, there've also been several podcasts run by more progressive, younger generation Chinese. I think they're Chinese nationals. They're not Chinese Americans. They're either academics or journalists or news junkies here. In their podcasts, they're talking in length about the electoral college, the underlying issues of the democracy, more of the in-depth problem, issues that more of the in-depth problems that we're running into here in this election cycle. Their target audience, I don't think are the same as the WeChat accounts audience. Their target audience are the Chinese students here in the US and the working professionals here, as well as liberal Chinese in China who are interested in American politics and who cannot find other reliable news sources to learn about the election. And so it would be interesting to see how those outlets are going to grow in the next 4 years. I do think this is an interesting trend that has not been talked much about yet.
Thank you very much, Shen Lu. Next up, we have Khury Petersen-Smith. Khury is the Michael Ratner Middle East Fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. He researches US empire, militarization, and resistance in the Middle East and the Pacific. And tonight he's going to be talking about how US-China military tensions are playing out during the election and what the prospects for resistance look like. Go ahead, Khury.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. Grateful to be here. So I actually want to start with the last presidential debate that happened last week. And there was a moment where in an evening of jaw dropping, my jaw certainly dropped, where the moderator posed a question to Joe Biden that was, President Trump says that he would make China pay. Would you make China pay? And I actually want to, and he was speaking in reference to, or she was speaking rather in reference to the coronavirus pandemic in particular. But actually, I went back to the transcript to read it because the actual quote was even scarier than I remember. So I'll just read it. She said, this came after President Trump went on an anti-China tirade, basically exactly what Christian was describing. Everything was fine until, of course, China ruined everything by creating the virus and so on. And so after Trump goes on this rant, the moderator turns to Biden and says, I do want to ask you, Vice President Biden, about China. Let's talk about China more broadly. So not about China's relationship to the pandemic, but China in general. There have, of course, President Trump has said that they should pay for not being fully transparent in regards to the coronavirus. If you were president, would you make China pay? And please be specific. What would that look like? So the fact that that was the question from the moderator, I think itself speaks to what the conversation in Washington, in the narrowness of that conversation is. And of course, the question itself was not questioned by Biden. He said, well, what I'd like to do is make China play by the international rules, not like he has done, referring to President Trump. So in terms of foreign policy, Biden is signaling a return to a pre-Trump approach of US empire that draws upon the various institutions of global governance like the United Nations and international, other institutions of international law with US power at the center of it, as opposed to the more transactional way that Trump has approached things, and the kind of, we'll use these structures if they're useful to us, and otherwise we'll have utter contempt for things like international law. So Biden, he goes on in his response, and he does as the moderator asks, and responds to his thoughts, gives his thoughts on China in general. He talks about China in terms of trade, in terms of intellectual property, kind of reiterating the tropes that we're all familiar with about how China is essentially cheating and not playing by the rules. And he ends by saying this: we're in a situation where China would have to play by the rules internationally as well. When I met with Xi, and when I was still vice president, he said, we're setting up air identification zones in the South China Sea. You can't fly through them. I said, we're gonna fly through them. We just flew B-52, B-1 bombers through it. We're not going to pay attention. Whoa, sorry about that. Yeah, so I got too riled up by Biden and his strength on China. So, first of all, I think that it says a lot about Biden's conception, once again, of US power in a kind of international law context. We're going to make China play by the rules, which means that we are going to enforce US power, is essentially what he means by that. But really, that's the whole point of what Biden's kind of orientation toward China is. It is about reiterating and reinforcing the US power. And what was really striking to me about this exchange was actually that it happened at all, that there was a conversation about US military strategy. And we usually don't see much of that, I think, in Washington, because there's such a high level of unity, actually. There's such unity on the notion that the US should reign supreme, and there's such unity on identifying China in particular as the enemy, that there's really no need for a debate because there's such a high level of agreement. There are hawks, of course, who are particularly enthusiastic, people like Tom Cotton, who, for whom, China is a particular enemy, various Fox News personalities who in their China bashing talk about the need for military competition with China in particular. But for the most part, there's bipartisan unity in Washington on the military policy, something that I'll get into momentarily. And in what that looks like in practice, it's not just rhetorical, again, because there isn't much of a need for the rhetoric. In practice, it looks like the ever increasing military budgets that Congress passes, again, with tremendous bipartisan support. What those budgets actually have been paying for, among other things, is a reorientation of the US Navy, a kind of recasting of the Navy, and in preparation of the officer corps for a different kind of warfare. During the Cold War, of course, naval officers and naval personnel were prepared to fight against a peer, against Russia. After the end of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, the humanitarian, so-called humanitarian interventions in the 1990s, and then the war on terror, naval warfare has not really been a central feature for the past couple of decades. The people who run the military, who run the Pentagon, have identified that if China is going to be a rising military competitor, then they must prepare for things like naval warfare, and that is precisely what the US military budget has paid for, those kinds of trainings and actual materiel, submarines, other naval vessels. If you think about the past 20 years of the war on terror, submarines, things like submarines haven't been, particularly useful in like fighting the Taliban, right? If the US is preparing to fight China, then it's going to require a new round of shipbuilding and things like that. That is what the military budget, which has been increasing each year, pays for, and there is bipartisan unity on that. So with that, I want to go from last week to this week, as the campaign continues here in advance of the election next week. At the moment, Secretary of State Pompeo and Secretary of Defense Esper are in Asia, actually, as we speak, negotiating various military agreements with different Asian partner states. Their first stop was in India, where they laid wreaths at an Indian shrine to soldiers in New Delhi, honoring soldiers who were killed in this year's confrontation of the India-China border. This example is packed with such significance because it really represents a years-long ongoing dynamic, not only between the US and India, but various allies in the region, in which there are various Asian states who have their own histories of conflict and contemporary tensions with China. And the United States is happy to not only encourage those hostilities rhetorically, but actually escalate the likelihood of conflict between those states and China by arming and pursuing other military cooperation with those allies, which is precisely what they were doing in India. They were talking about sharing intelligence and things like that. And Pompeo is explicitly naming China as an adversary, a common adversary for both the US and India. I want to underscore that this is a years-long dynamic and process. There is, of course, a long-standing history of US hostility toward China and Chinese migrants going back to the 18th century. But there is a post-Cold War anti-China hostility on the part of the US that, in particular, that is aimed at maintaining US supremacy since the fall of the Soviet Union and really crystallized in the context of the war on terror. So this is bipartisan, and it goes back to the Bush administration. When Biden brags about his own role as the vice president in the Obama administration, in terms of US aggression toward China, he's really speaking accurately. Really, the current iteration of US military policy toward China was set, I would argue, under Obama and what he called the pivot or rebalance to Asia. The idea was redistributing US forces to militarily contain China and to undermine its military rise. So really the precursor to the current trip that Pompeo and Esper are doing in Asia now actually came, I would argue, with Hillary Clinton, whose article when shortly after she became Secretary of State, published in Foreign Policy magazine, America's Pacific Century, signaled an open US strategy to counter China economically, diplomatically, and militarily. In her implementing this strategy as Secretary of State, she coined the phrase forward deployed diplomacy, which is really quite a remarkable phrase when you think about it. It is a marriage of the kind of diplomatic Secretary of State role and the military role. She's pointing out that really, as Secretary of State, she's playing, she's carrying out military policy, and that's precisely what she did. Negotiate all sorts of military agreements, increase or support the increase of trainings, joint trainings, and other activities under the heading of what they call interoperability, the ability of the US military to work hand in glove with various allies and so on throughout the region. And of course, selling more weapons to various allied states. So this all led to a major round of militarization in Asia and the Pacific, both in terms of US militarization in the region, constructing and expanding more US bases, locating more personnel. One of the central parts of the pivot to Asia was to, whereas previously naval and air personnel were split 50-50 between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, the idea was to rebalance so that the Pacific Ocean would have 60% of US naval and Air Force personnel, and locating more weapons in the region as well. And also the arming of allied militaries through US weapons sales. Now, it's worth saying that this did not just take place in Asia. Africa too has been a site of militarization in the context of the US-China rivalry, right? We know that there's all sorts of economic competition between the United States and China throughout the world, actually, in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, and so on. But we've seen that play out in some militarized ways in Africa in particular. So I won't get into that, but that's just worth noting and putting on the table. But when it comes to Asia, there has been the kind of militarization and the rivalry, the militarization that's being driven by the US-China rivalry has encouraged more regional military conflict and tension with China as the various contests in the South China Sea over islands, fishing rights, and other territorial claims. Now, this is all terrifying, of course, because it does increase the likelihood of military conflict in the region and of direct conflict between the United States and China as well. There's all sorts of agreements, of formal agreements, that the United States has with its allies, like Japan and South Korea, that lay out legally that an attack on one of those countries constitutes an attack on the United States, right? And therefore, if there's a military conflict between China and Japan, then the United States is obligated to jump in. And then there's all sorts of, in addition to the formal agreements, there's increased collaboration between the US and allied militaries, more joint trainings, intelligence sharing, and things like that, and just a greater presence of US military personnel, which means that if there is a conflict between China and the military of a US ally, there's just more of a likelihood that US personnel would actually be involved. Now, as scary as that dangerous future is, it shouldn't prevent us from looking at the violence of the present, which is really what I want to kind of start to wrap up on. When the US is expanding and constructing bases in the region, that actually constitutes violence when it is adding personnel and constructing bases in Guam, in Okinawa, in South Korea as well. That means that local residents pay the price for that militarization, whether or not there's a war with China. Just last week, actually, there was another major protest in Sungju in South Korea against the base where the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System, or THAAD, missile battery is located in South Korea. This kind of missile system is something that's garnered a lot of opposition and resistance in South Korea. And the US and South Korean states have committed really to locating more of those weapons in South Korea. That is impacting people locally, and it has provoked resistance. It's also worth just noting, at least briefly, that the kind of US militarization that has been, again, on track for several years, it has continued unabated this year despite the coronavirus pandemic. And that has also had consequences for people locally. So people will know that there was a major outbreak on a US aircraft carrier docked in Guam. That was terrifying, not only for the US personnel on that ship, but for the residents of Guam on this island, who rightly feared what would happen if that outbreak spread throughout their island. Similarly, in Okinawa and in South Korea, where the local governments have taken really very effective measures actually to counter coronavirus, there's been outbreaks among US personnel on US military bases, which spells danger for the residents of those places. So just to wrap up, the militarism is really scary. There has been unity really within the Pentagon for a long time on this kind of strategy of identifying China as an enemy and therefore taking the steps militarily to counter China's rise. I think that, again, unfortunately, that is not only within the military brass, but it is largely shared among at least the leaderships of both parties, the Democrats and Republicans. I think that there's a lot to do in terms of demanding demilitarization here for our part in the US. I also think it's important to build solidarity with and take inspiration from the various struggles throughout the region, in Guam, in Okinawa, in South Korea, in Hawaii, against the various militarization schemes there as well. And I actually think that building solidarity with those resistance movements will be part of our role in terms of demilitarization here, advancing demilitarization here in the United States. So, thank you.
Thank you, Khury. Just a reminder to everyone in the audience that if you have any questions, please feel free to post them as we go along in the chat. We have a set of CCS operatives who are underground collecting your questions, and we'll make sure that they get to me. So no problem to just post as they come to mind. Our final panelist tonight is Tobita Chow. Tobita is the director of Justice is Global, a special project of People's Action to build a more just and sustainable global economy and defeat right-wing nationalism. His recent work focuses on countering the growth of xenophobia and anti-Asian racism under the COVID-19 crisis. He has been organizing for racial and economic justice for over a decade, beginning with community organizing on the south side of Chicago soon after Obama's 2008 election victory. Tobita is going to talk about the organizing context that he's coming out of, and as well as how to respond to the rise of anti-China politics. Tobita.
Thanks, and thanks everyone for being here. So I want to start with some notes on long-term strategy before I start talking about like how the stuff has been playing out in progressive circles this year in the US. So I think there's an important point here where, in order to formulate a strategy to get us out of this great power conflict between the US and China and overcome anti-China politics in the United States, we need to sort of take a step back and understand the root causes of these trends at like a deep systemic level. And our analysis at Justice is Global is that fundamentally, this is a product or like a symptom of a global problem. What we've seen over the past decade are growing dysfunctions in the global system of neoliberal capitalism. We had the financial crisis and the resulting recession in 2008. And what we see since then is that although the recession technically ended, global capitalism is a global system has not fully recovered. It hasn't fully returned to health. And I'm talking about health here, like by the standards of capitalism itself. So like a key indicator of health under capitalism is economic growth. So a problem that we've seen throughout the past decade is that economic growth has been very weak. And this is important to understand the US-China conflict, as well as the rise of nationalist populist movements around the world, and the rise of nationalism, like on every continent of the planet, including in the US and China. With economic growth at the global level being weak, what that leads to is it encourages a spirit of zero-sum competition between all countries on the planet. So what we see is the US, China, and a whole range of countries entering this like framework where they're engaging in increasingly cutthroat competition to grab a larger piece of the shrinking pie of economic growth. And like this is a thing that every country has to do under capitalism, is secure economic growth for its national economy. And with the global economy becoming more and more dysfunctional, that's just pushing countries more and more into this sense of zero-sum competition between countries. And that is a major factor behind this growth of nationalism that we see in the US, in China, in India, a bunch of other countries across Asia, Europe, Africa, and Latin America as well. With that perspective in mind, what we need to do strategically is do two things at once. So on the one hand, we need to defend against the bad. We need to do whatever we can to counter the politics of great power conflict and all the ugly crap that comes along with that, the nationalism, the racism, the xenophobia, the militarism, the red baiting and scapegoating. Like we need to counter that stuff and counter it directly. But also we need to put ourselves on a pathway to transformation, like a really radical transformation of the way the entire global economy works, that is going to get us past these like growing dysfunctions that are at the root of this like cycle of nationalist and antagonism and great power conflict. So we need to figure out a way to do both of those things at once. So this is obviously very challenging, but I think there's a lot of hope here. And I think like one way this needs to, one like immediate project is to oppose nationalism and great power conflict with the importance and demands around global cooperation. This is essential to any project of a progressive transformation of the global economy. We need countries to be working together on that project, and in particular, we need the top two economies to be engaged in that project together. It's also essential immediately to deal with shared global challenges, such as the pandemic. We don't solve this pandemic unless we see much more robust international cooperation, and in particular between the US and China. Another major global challenge that is also a significant opportunity for an alternative kind of politics around the US-China relationship is climate change. Climate change is going to be one of the key fronts in progressive politics under, knock on wood, hopefully a Biden administration, and then for decades to come. And great power competition is not going to give us the US-China cooperation that we need in order to solve climate change. We have a lot of potential to make serious, rapid progress if the US and China can figure out how to work together on climate. Otherwise, the outlook is very dire. So global cooperation versus nationalism is like a key place for us all to be working in, like figuring out how to build power and build up a politics of global cooperation around shared challenges, and use that as a space to try to build a sense of global solidarity rather than us versus them nationalism. So there are some serious obstacles here that it's important to recognize, right? So like as progressive movements in the United States, we don't have movement-wide sort of depth of understanding of China, of the US-China relationship. An important aspect of how this dynamic is playing out domestically is this rise in anti-Chinese and more broadly anti-Asian racism. And that topic as well is something that is, I think, not very familiar to progressive movements in general. And the trick here is that anti-Asian racism, there's a lot of different forms of racism and prejudice in general, but they all operate like differently from each other. So anti-Asian racism is not like anti-Black racism. It's not like xenophobia against Central American immigrants. It takes a different form. And I think just as a progressive movement, there's some work we need to do to figure out the specific contours of this form of racism and how to counter it. But I will say that we have a long way to go, but things have come a long way already this year, and I'm quite hopeful. So there's a series of fronts we need to fight on, and different ways that we need to build and exercise power in order to counter this anti-China politics and start to build an alternative. And I want to name some ways that this is already starting to come into focus. So one thing we need to do is we need to develop demands and build campaigns around demands that can counter great power conflict and fight for something new and different. So one thing that we're doing at Justice is Global is we're working with a set of allies on a campaign for global cooperation to end the pandemic. And this includes some things like challenging the intellectual property rights regime and how that's getting in the way of international cooperation around a new vaccine. That's a really interesting piece because the intellectual property rights regime plays an important structural role in the status quo global economy and upholding the neoliberal order globally. So if we can start to build an alternative to the intellectual property rights regime around this issue of a vaccine, which is just a pressing need for everyone around the world, that can sort of set an important precedent for further fights around constructing a future beyond neoliberalism at the global level. Another way we need to build power is we need to build grassroots organizations of people who really get the need to build an alternative to anti-China politics and share like this global analysis. We need to build grassroots organizations of committed internationalists, people for whom internationalism is like a key value that holds us together. We also need to do this specifically within the communities that are on the front line, that being the Chinese diaspora and other Asian diasporas who are caught in the middle through this rise of anti-Asian racism this year. And these communities are contested, as we heard before. They're within the Chinese American base. There are a lot of pro-Trump voters, but there are also openings here as more and more people in these communities realize how dangerous this rise of anti-China politics is. International students from China are another crucial base where there's real potential to start to organize a new like internationalist power base. Another important piece, and I'll end on this, is working on developing counter narratives to the anti-China messages that are out there. And we did a project around this in this summer. We organized a crew of volunteers to make phone calls to Democratic and independent voters in the swing states of Michigan and Wisconsin Michigan and Pennsylvania. And we just talked to these strangers about what they have experienced and what they've been hearing around the pandemic and around China. And this was very encouraging for all of us. I was personally very encouraged. We surfaced a lot of the anti-China sentiment that we knew was out there, but we're able, in the space of just one conversation with a stranger, able to move people away from that and towards understanding the value of US-China cooperation and what that would do, for example, in developing a vaccine and getting that to everyone who needs it. So a big takeaway from that is that because of the role that anti-China discourse has played in politics this year, the anti-China sentiment is very broad in the general population of the United States. It is, however, very shallow. It's like at the level where a lot of people have heard on the news that Trump has said Chinese virus a bunch of times, and that's given them a negative association with China and with Chinese people, but they haven't thought about it deeply. You know, a lot of these people don't even know a Chinese person personally, right? So it is possible to work people through that and strengthen counter narratives and pull them to a different way of understanding China and the US-China relationship. You know, we have a long way to go, but I think that the way things have played out this year, it could have been much worse, and there are signs for hope. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Toby. I'm tempted to just cut everything off there because we end on a note of hope, and I'm worried that the questions are gonna bring us down. But let's just bravely march forward and see what happens. All right, so I'm gonna just read a couple questions together and get the panelists to respond, and then we'll go with the follow-up batch as long as we have time. So Khury, there's a couple specifically addressed to you. One questioner asks about the possibilities for politically linking up that you were talking about and asks you to suggest some good places. A second one for Khury, can you address the dynamics of US withdrawal and disengagement in Central Asia and ramping up of China's military aid in the region in terms of escalating military conflicts in the region? And then a few that are addressed broadly to anyone who would like to respond. One, why is the US media so Sinophobic? There are almost no counter narratives on China being published in mainstream news. So that's a big question, but let's try to resolve that in the next couple minutes. And a broad question, a less broad question, for the panelists, how do you view the work of the people at the Quincy Institute, who publish a lot of stuff arguing against American empire and the military-industrial complex, but also receive funding from the Koch Foundation and accommodate a lot of conservative critiques of American interventionism? And I'd like to just add on to that question that Quincy also is funded by sorace as well. And sorace, specifically with regard to this question, sorace has under his own byline, published very strongly anti-China work. So that is also of interest. And let's see, I want to add one question of my own for the panelists. What would you say to those people who respond to your arguments against ramping up of US-China hostilities by saying, well, China is a bad actor. I'm sorry, the US needs to respond to an authoritarian power that is more and more assertive in the world, that is more and more repressive at home. At Critical China Scholars, we do not deny those facts, that China is more assertive in the world, is gaining in power and potentially could use that power in oppressive ways in the world, and is undoubtedly using the power of the state in increasingly repressive ways at home. How would you respond to people who would dismiss the analyses that you've been giving by saying, why are you talking about racism? Why are you talking about psychoanalysis? It's just because China is doing bad stuff and we have to respond. So why don't we start, Khury, with the questions that were addressed to you, and then we'll kind of open it up to the other panelists.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just on that last piece that where you ended, Jake. You know, I'll leave it to Christian again to come back, but I think that there's something really important there about you know, what it means for the U.S. to have an enemy all the time. I mean, like you know, I challenge challenge those on this call to think of a time in U.S. history when there was not an enemy, you know, to be rallied against. And if there's something about that feels daunting, like the idea of addressing something very deep, you know, when it comes to drivers of U.S. policy, I think it's daunting because it is deep. I mean, I think that if we're seriously talking about stepping back from the U.S.-China rivalry and doing the work that it would take in this country to do that, then we're actually, I think that we're actually getting at some existential stuff about the United States. You know, I think that there is a role that various other, you know, enemies have played, and at the moment it's China. And we've got to question that whole, in addition to the particulars around China, we've got to question that whole approach, actually, which I think, again, really means raising some existential questions about the United States as a project. So that's, you know, whatever. We can have many Zoom calls on that question. I think that just on the question of linking up, I believe the, I heard that question as like, you know, who to connect to, who are kind of doing things, if you're interested in pursuing these questions. And so, you know, of course, if you're already on this call, you know about critical China scholars, so that's great. And I just, in the chat, I shouted out Toby's organization, Justice is Global, which I think is really doing critical work in terms of contesting the U.S.-China rivalry at so many levels, and building solidarity at, you know, from the local to really the transnational level. So that's great too. And then my own organization, the Institute for Policy Studies, you can check out as well. You know, we're a think tank that advances critical research on U.S. domestic and foreign policy. The questions on the war on terror, you know, is what I'll end on, and kind of the relationship of, for example, U.S. withdrawal from Central Asia, supposed withdrawal, you know, or really reduction of you know, massive forces in Central Asia to a less massive presence, you know, and the relationship of that with the U.S.-China rivalry. And I'll link that to the question that Fabio asks in the chat about the relationship between the war on terror and U.S.-China rivalry too. Because I think that there's a connection there. You know, I think that it shows that the war on terror, I mean, people on this call won't be surprised to know that it was never about fighting terrorism. It was always about maintaining U.S. hegemony in the world. And the struggle for that hegemony, to maintain it, comes in the context of competition, economic, political, and otherwise, with various states, you know, not necessarily as equal peers competing, but, you know, the US is worried about Russia and China and other states. And so the idea that now, after this just catastrophe on every level in Afghanistan, you know, the US is trying to figure out how to extricate itself from that particular conflict, at the same time as China, through the One Belt, One Road initiative and others, is trying to figure out how to be more influential in the region. You know, this is the competition playing out, right, in various ways. So you could argue that the war on terror, there was a part of that was always about China, actually, always about confronting China. I do think it's worth saying too, and Fabio kind of speaks to this in the question, that, you know, so there's the war on terror as a context for the U.S. to advance U.S. power, right, and including to kind of push back the rise of peer competitors. It is also the case that this sort of this notion that the U.S. can fight terrorism and justify military conflict in the name of fighting terrorism really was a gift to the various states of the world, such that even a rival like China finds some currency and some utility that China can say, we too are fighting terrorism. You know, it's the thing that the U.S. and China can unite on. And it's worth saying, and again, we don't have time to get into all of this, but Islamophobia, I mean, we really have to talk about Islamophobia in that as well. You know, the war on terror has been a war on Muslims by the US state, by the Chinese state, by the Nigerian state, by the Kenyan state, and so on. So, I'll just say that to circle back to actually how Jake opened this conversation, which is that the US and China, for all of the rhetoric about how vastly different the East and the West are, we can't possibly see eye to eye, these states and these governments have a lot more in common than they have dividing them. And the challenge always, I think, when we think about building solidarity among ordinary people, is for us to realize the same, like we too have more in common with the ordinary people of China and throughout Asia and throughout the world than we do with the people who run this government or the people who run that government. And so the challenge is, how can we kind of build those links and carve a path in a very different direction for a demilitarized and peaceful future?
Thanks, Khury. Any of the other panelists want to jump on any of those other questions?
If I can, Jake, can you
Yeah,
hear
go
me?
ahead, Christian.
All right, sorry. Yeah, I just want to, let me try to see what I can do to respond to Rebecca's question of what can we do despite an overwhelming sense of hopelessness. Although Toby made some convincing points about why we should not get too attached to our own desperation, and why there might be hidden nuggets of optimism that we can, if we're looking, we can actually see and seize on. But to respond, I want to also build off of what Toby said about counter narratives. And for those of you who know me before, have heard me go back to this example, I'm kind of fixated on it. So I apologize if you've heard me talk about this, but a lot of you are new faces or new virtual avatars and blank screens. So anyway, I'll say it anyway. Back in the final debate in the Democratic primary, Bernie and Biden were arguing about Cuba. And then Bernie ended up saying something positive about the transformations and that have occurred in China. And Biden interrupts him by saying, "Would you be saying something positive about Jack the Ripper?" So this is like where Khury said, like your jaw was dropping, right? In the last debate, when I heard that, I honestly, if like my head just, exploded, and then it was, so. Why I pinpoint this moment is because it's precisely that opportunity in a very subtle way where Bernie is trying to reframe the discourse and kind of insert a new way of being able to speak apart from these existentially, inflammatory, almost hysterical talking points that are somehow normalized, right? They're somehow the fact that, as Khury pointed out, the fact that that moderator even asked that question and framed it in that way, right? So here we need to refuse those questions and to refuse those terms and to try to open up a space of speaking differently. And one way of doing that is not, to answer Rebecca's question, and maybe this is a slight way of not answering it, but is that maybe we don't talk, to change the discourse on China is not to talk about China directly, but if we start to attack or challenge the underlying phantasmatic investments in American exceptionalism, in the goodness of Americans, in how we think about US history, then potentially that will open up once we start to see ourselves differently, then maybe we can then it will allow for seeing others differently and reframing that. I want to, there is a comment that Art Francisco made challenging Toby a little bit for using cooperation. And I think it's interesting in a certain way that maybe does cooperation somehow play, it's useful, but does it somehow play back into this narrative that we also, I think, all of us are in some way are trying to transcend of, you know, the perspective of nation states and as the sovereign actors. We're trying to get away from that. And I think Art Francisco mentioned, can we talk about something like proletarian solidarity? And I think Toby's that whole idea, I love it so much. I love it so much, that the thinking about using COVID-19 and the why is my mind going blank? The vaccine for the virus as an opportunity to start challenging the not just narratives, but also systems that enforce intellectual property. And if we can do it in this emergency by making it free and globally distributed and available to everybody, because we know from COVID that you know, if people, everybody needs to be vaccinated, right? If we can think about that, then maybe that opens up a way of rethinking and reframing some of the other issues that we get trapped in. So I had this note, and I was going to say this earlier in my talk. Christopher Wray, the FBI director, recently said, "It's the people of the United States who are victims of what amounts to Chinese theft on a scale so massive that it represents one of the largest transfers of wealth in human history." I like nearly spit my coffee out when I read that. Since everybody's mics are off, I'm wondering if how many people, like, you know, just read that out loud to yourself. Okay, thank you. I got you got more jaw dropping. The fact that, you know, do I even need to talk about indigenous dispossession and slavery and racism? No, I mean, with this audience, hopefully I don't need to talk about that. But so what we need to do, and this is the last thing in terms of fighting, trying to have new counter hegemonic narratives is maybe we need to, rather than think about when Christopher Wray later in this speech that he gives says our knowledge is being stolen, and then instead of responding in how that question is framed, oh no, it's not, it's actually not as bad, you can't paint, you know, we're already accepting those premises. So maybe we refuse and reject those premises and start saying, what do you mean our knowledge, when this is you can use from Marx, the general intellect, or for our more liberal leaning friends, you know, patrimony of humanity, if you don't want to use the general intellect, whatever, but start to say this belongs to all of us. And I love Toby's point that the vaccine could be that first way to push through broader claims of thinking about our relations, of emancipating knowledge from the confines of intellectual property.
Thank you, Christian. Let me add two more questions here and then get Shen Lu and Toby to respond to them, because these are directed to you. And I'd also welcome both of you to respond to the earlier questions that we raised. So for Shen Lu, questioner asks, Taiwan voters apparently back Trump over Biden because they perceive Trump as Taiwan friendly. Does PRC media comment at all on the two candidates' statements on Taiwan or Hong Kong or Xinjiang? Do they see Biden as more PRC friendly? And then for Toby, the question that Christian brought up is a long one, but the gist of it is essentially you're talking about global cooperation. It seems like you're talking about the kind of global cooperation that existed before the relationship broke down recently, which was essentially cooperation between elites of the two countries at the expense of the working class of the two countries. And what kind of cooperation are you talking about? And can we start talking about something more like proletarian cooperation? So let's start with Shen Lu. And please respond to the general questions that we raised earlier if you'd like as well.
Sure. So I think that question came from Andy. No, I don't think state media have responded to any of the statements on China. State media have stayed largely strategically silent on the US election. It's very hard to tell whether they think Biden is China friendly or Trump is more China friendly. Particularly this year, they don't want to they don't want to be read as opposing or endorsing either of the candidate. And I think MOFA spokesperson Zhao Lijian has made it very clear a few days ago in one of his daily briefings. He said, we're not interested in the presidential election in the US, and I hope they don't make China an issue in the election anymore. And I can also try to tackle the US media being xenophobic question. I don't think all US media is xenophobic. Their coverage of China is often simplistic, in my view, and sometimes problematic. They are covering China mostly through the lens of geopolitics instead of looking at China on its own term and looking at China on their own terms. I think that has something to do with their readership being Americans here. And I think also it has to do with how China is taught in the US. I mean, I didn't come to school. I didn't go to K through 12 here, so I don't know how it's taught, but I assume it has to do with the way China is taught here in the US schools. And the problem is that there is a lack of understanding of China in most of the US newsrooms. There is, most American reporters do not speak Chinese, do not read Chinese, or don't even know any Chinese person personally. So China is just, to them, a vague idea. And that's why I think a lot of them tend to see Chinese people not as individuals, but rather citizens of an authoritarian country who have no agency. And I hope that, as China becomes a bigger story, a bigger international story, US newsroom in the future will hire more Chinese speaking reporters, people who do understand China, or even people who come from China.
Thank you, Shen Lu. And may I say that I think Shen Lu's organization, Chinese Storytellers, is going to have an important role to play there. It's Shen Lu and other reporters with a much deeper connection to China, trying to tell the story. So thank you for all your work on that.
Thanks, Jake, for the plug.
And Toby.
Yeah, so I'll start with this point about shouldn't we be building not international cooperation, but proletarian internationalism? So I think that's the goal. Like when I first, and others involved in Justice is Global, including in Jake, like early on when we started to work on this project that then became Justice is Global, the idea was proletarian internationalism and building a global working class movement. The problem is, at the same time that we were embarking on that idea of like a mission, nationalist crackdowns in China and then now in the US have steadily escalated, and the work of building working class solidarity or any kind of grassroots solidarity between the US and China has just gotten more and more difficult to like shading into the realm of the impossible at this point. Until last year, we thought that Hong Kong could be a place where, like, Hong Kong has functioned as a place where civil society in mainland China, including underground groups, could connect with civil society from outside of China. And but then now with the crackdown, the national security law in Hong Kong, the space for that is disappearing as well. And it looks to be getting more and more dangerous for groups in Hong Kong to like play that role. So yes, to proletarian internationalism, the problem is that we need to do what we can to counter the US-China conflict in order to create more space for that kind of proletarian internationalism. So the trick is, how do we find ways to do that and to build forms of global cooperation that aren't the Henry Kissinger crap, but are challenging the status quo of neoliberal capitalism at the global level, in ways that don't require us to do the impossible of like building deep relationships between grassroots workers in the US and China at a mass scale, like, you know. So, you know, places like where can we attack the intellectual property rights regime? Like, I think there are some opportunities there. Like these are like just we're caught in the middle of these huge global forces that are colliding around us and like threaten to crush us. So it's very difficult to find the opportunities, but I think they do exist, and we can like worm our way into those cracks and, you know, like do the thing where, like, you know, in winter, I'm in Chicago, water seeps into the cracks of the cement and then freezes. And then little by little, you get these huge potholes that ruin your car, whatever. So we can be, I need a more constructive metaphor that's purely destructive, but, you know, find the cracks, get in there, and then use that space to expand the space and create something new. I want to also talk about this point about Jake's question about what do you say to people who say that China is just a bad actor. I think we need to get clear about what is it, like, first of all, what can we actually do to improve human rights situations or to protect democracy, like democratic rights in Hong Kong or whatever, from the United States? Like, reality check, it's quite limited. The Chinese government is hella powerful. Like our ability to force them to, like, there's this illusion in the US ruling class that if we just did it right, we could make China stop doing this. And like, that is an illusion. China is very powerful and like can stand up to demands from the US government. And there's a further set of delusions around the idea that increasing US-China tensions are somehow going to contribute to liberation for Uyghurs in Xinjiang. I think there's a challenge that we can make to people who make that argument about, like, okay, you know, so like people have said to me, oh, you're against the trade war, but what about the Uyghurs? I'm like, this is a crazy like change in topic. How in the world do you think that a trade war is going to benefit Uyghurs? Like, what concentration camp in Xinjiang is going to shut down as a result of the trade war, right? I think there's a critique we can make of this whole idea that anti-China politics is somehow going to lead to improved conditions. And I mean, we saw this play out in Hong Kong. Like, the anti-China politics of Trump did nothing to save democracy and civil rights in Hong Kong. And I think arguably it is in fact contributed to weakening the position of protesters in Hong Kong. And now we see the results, these just escalating threats against civil society in Hong Kong. Another piece there is we need to do much better at building a critical left internationalist flank within sort of the people who are caught in the middle. So like the outstanding example of that in Hong Kong is Lausanne, made up of a lot of different kinds of people, but mainly people in the Hong Kong diaspora who have a critical position of the US-China conflict and can sort of represent what we should think is the correct position, that this US-China conflict is not the way that people in Hong Kong are going to gain their liberation. And we need analogs for that with folks from like Taiwan, Uyghurs, like this is all infrastructure that we don't have. Like, we're so weak and vulnerable on all these fronts, but this is stuff that we need to build out. And yeah, I'll stop with that.
Okay, we are at time. I want to wrap it up. Just thanks again to our presenters. This was a great conversation. Thanks as well to our co-sponsors, Justices Global, Made in China, Positions Politics, and Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, New York office. A reminder that the Critical China Scholars next webinar will be China's Capitalism and the World on November 19th. You can register for that webinar, as well as find how to get onto the CCS listserv if you like, at our webpage, which is criticalchinascholars.org. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and have a great night.